$72 million is remarkable for someone your age, Miss Bennett. Those were the exact words Attorney Wells said, and I remember them clearly because of what followed: the silence. It was not the normal kind of silence you get when people are thinking. This was different. It was heavy, like the air itself had stopped moving. We were all sitting in my grandfather's old house, the one he had owned for decades. It stood quietly in the countryside, far from the busy cities of Europe and America that my family loved so much. The house had tall windows, long curtains, and walls filled with portraits of people who had built our name. Every year, we gathered there for one reason: family. Or at least, that's what they called it. My mother, Eleanor Bennett, turned her head slowly toward me. I could hear the faint sound of her pearl necklace shifting as she moved. My father, Richard Bennett, froze with his champagne glass halfway to his lips, as if even he wasn't sure what he had just heard. My sister, Clara, dropped her fork onto her plate, the sound sharp in the quiet room. And Aunt Margaret let out a soft gasp that she didn't even try to hide. But me? I didn't move at all. I simply sat there, looking straight ahead, as if nothing had changed. Because, in truth, nothing had. Not for me. What surprised me wasn't the number. It wasn't even the reaction of my family. What surprised me was that the moment had finally arrived. For 3 years, I had been waiting for something like this, though I never expected it to happen in such a public way. I slowly turned my eyes toward the head of the table, where my grandfather, Edward Bennett, was sitting. His hands rested calmly on the polished wood, and his expression was as steady as ever. When our eyes met, he gave me a small, knowing smile. That was when I understood. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a mistake. He had planned this. Every second of it. And as I looked around the room, at the same people who had spent years overlooking me, I realized something else too. None of them knew the truth. Not really. Not yet. And before I could say a single word, I knew one thing for certain. This dinner was no longer just a family gathering. It had become something else entirely. If you had asked my family about me 3 years ago, they would have all said the same thing in different ways. She's quiet. She keeps to herself. She'll figure something out eventually. None of them meant it in a cruel way. That's the strange part. They simply didn't see me as important enough to think deeply about. I was there, but I didn't matter in the way Clara did, or in the way my father's business partners did, or even in the way my aunt's opinions somehow always filled a room. And for a long time, I let them believe that. Back then, we were living in one of our houses in London. It was large, like all Bennett homes, but it never felt warm. My parents were always traveling between cities in Europe and America, attending meetings, signing deals, and making sure the Bennett name stayed strong. Clara was busy living the life everyone expected her to live: dinners, parties, laughter that carried through halls filled with expensive decorations. And me? I stayed in my room. At least, that's what they thought. What they didn't know was that my room had become something else entirely. It wasn't just a place to sleep. It was where everything began. I had a small desk by the window, a laptop, and stacks of notebooks filled with ideas that I never shared with anyone. I didn't start with a grand plan. I started with a question. What if I could build something of my own? Not something connected to the Bennett name. Not something given to me. Something that was mine because I made it. The first person who took me seriously was Daniel Reeves. I met him through a small online discussion about business ideas. He didn't know who I was, and I didn't tell him. To him, I was just Olivia. That was enough. Daniel had a way of understanding numbers that I had never seen before. He could look at a simple idea and tell you exactly how it could grow, or why it would fail. When I shared my early thoughts with him, I expected him to dismiss them the way my family would have. Instead, he said, "This could work." That was the first time anyone had said that to me. Not long after, I met Sophia Clark. She was different from both of us. Where Daniel focused on logic, Sophia saw people. She understood how to take something simple and make others believe in it. She knew how to turn an idea into something real. The three of us were very different, but somehow, it worked. We started small, with only a few $1,000s that I had saved over time. It wasn't much, especially compared to what my family was used to. But to me, it felt like everything. Those early days were not easy. There were nights when nothing made sense, when numbers didn't add up, when decisions felt too big for someone like me. I remember sitting at my desk long after midnight, staring at my screen, wondering if I was making a mistake. But every time I thought about stopping, I remembered something. If I quit, I would go back to being invisible.
And that was something I refused to accept. So I kept going.
Daniel worked tirelessly, checking every detail, making sure we didn't make careless mistakes. Sophia reached out to people, building connections in ways I never could have done on my own.
And I
held it all together.
I made the decisions when things felt uncertain. I took responsibility when something went wrong.
And slowly, piece by piece, we built something that started to grow. By the end of the first year, we had turned our small beginning into something real. We weren't just experimenting anymore. We were succeeding.
The numbers were no longer small. They were steady, and they were growing.
That was when I realized this was no longer just an idea. This was a future.
The second year was different. Harder in some ways, but also clearer. We knew what we were doing now.
We expanded, took bigger risks, and stepped into spaces that once felt far beyond our reach.
There were moments when I thought about telling my family.
I imagined sitting at the dinner table, explaining everything, how I had spent my time, what I had built, what it had become.
But every time, I stopped myself. Not because I was afraid they wouldn't believe me, but because I knew exactly how they would react.
They would be surprised, yes, maybe even impressed for a moment.
But then they would take over.
They would ask questions that weren't really questions. They would try to guide it, shape it, control it.
And it would stop being mine. So I stayed quiet.
By the third year, everything had changed. The numbers that once felt impossible had become real.
1 million turned into 10. 10 turned into more.
Each step forward felt less like luck and more like proof. Proof that I had been right to trust myself. Proof that being overlooked had given me something powerful, the freedom to build without interference.
The only person who knew the truth was my grandfather.
I still remember the day I told him. We were sitting in his library, the same quiet room filled with books and soft light. I expected questions.
Doubt, maybe. Instead, he listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't react too quickly. He just listened until I had finished saying everything. And then he smiled.
Not the polite kind of smile people use when they don't understand.
It was different. It was the kind of smile that told me he had seen something like this before. You did this on your own? He asked. Yes, I said.
He nodded slowly, as if confirming something to himself.
Good, he said. That was all. He didn't tell anyone. He didn't treat me differently.
But from that day on, I noticed something had changed between us. There was an understanding there, something quiet but strong. And now, sitting at that long table, with my family staring at me in disbelief, I realized something else. For 3 years, I had been invisible by choice. But that time was over. And they were only just beginning to see me. He was never the kind of man who needed attention. He didn't speak loudly, and he didn't interrupt people just to make a point. While others filled the room with opinions, he stayed quiet, observing everything with a patience that most people didn't have.
Growing up, I didn't fully understand him.
I only knew that being around him felt different, calmer, easier, as if I didn't have to prove anything. While the rest of my family moved between cities in Europe and America, always chasing something bigger, my grandfather stayed mostly in his countryside house. It was old, but not in a weak way. It felt strong, steady, like it had seen everything and didn't need to change to impress anyone.
That was where I always found him. And that was where he found me.
When I was younger, I used to sit with him in his library for hours. The room was quiet, filled with books and soft light that came through tall windows. He would sit in his chair, sometimes reading, sometimes just thinking. And every now and then, he would look at me and ask something simple. "What are you thinking about, Olivia?"
Not many people ask questions like that. Most people ask things they already expect answers to.
But with him, it was different.
He was actually listening.
Years later, when everything had already begun to change for me, I found myself sitting in that same library again. By then, I had already started building something of my own. The work, the long nights, the risks, it was all becoming real.
But no one in my family knew. No one except him. I hadn't planned to tell him.
I had spent so long keeping everything to myself that it had become natural. But that day, something felt different. Maybe it was the quiet of the room, or the way he looked at me like he already knew there was more behind my silence.
He asked his usual question.
"What have you been working on?" And for the first time, I didn't give a simple answer.
I told him everything.
I told him about the idea that started it all, something small that I had built slowly, piece by piece. I explained how I had met Daniel Reeves, how he had helped me understand the numbers and make sense of things that once felt too complicated. I told him about Sophia Clark, and how she had turned our ideas into something people actually believed in. I spoke about the risks we took, the mistakes we made, and the moments when I thought it might all fall apart. I told him about the growth, about how something that started with a few $1,000s had become something much bigger. And then I told him the numbers. Saying them out loud felt strange, almost unreal, as if they belonged to someone else. But he didn't react the way I expected. He didn't interrupt me. He didn't question me. He didn't show surprise or doubt. He just listened. Completely. When I finished, the room felt even quieter than before. I could hear the faint ticking of a clock somewhere behind me, steady and calm, like it had all the time in the world. For the first time in a long while, I felt uncertain. Not about what I had done, but about how it would be seen. He leaned back slightly in his chair, his hands resting on the armrests, his eyes still on me. There was no rush in his expression, no urgency to respond. It was as if he was taking a moment to place everything I had said into its proper space. "You built this yourself?" he asked. His voice was calm, but there was something behind it, something serious. "Yes," I replied. "And no one else in the family knows." I shook my head. Another pause followed, longer this time, but it didn't feel uncomfortable. It felt thoughtful. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Good," he said. Just one word. But it carried more meaning than anything else he could have said. I frowned slightly, unsure if I had heard him correctly. "Good." A small smile appeared on his face, not wide or dramatic, just enough to show that he understood something I didn't yet. "You built something without noise," he said. "Without interference. That is rare." I didn't respond immediately. To me, it had never felt like a choice. It had simply been the only way I knew how to do it. But to him, it meant something more. He leaned forward slightly, his expression growing more focused. "Most people," he continued, "build things while being watched. They are guided, corrected, sometimes even controlled. They succeed, but they never fully own what they create." His eyes met mine. "You did this alone. That makes it yours in a way they will never understand." I felt something shift inside me as he said that. Not pride exactly, but something quieter, something steadier. Then he said something I didn't expect. "Don't tell them yet." I blinked, surprised. "Why not?" He studied me for a moment before answering, as if he wanted to be sure I would understand. "Because right now," he said, "they see you clearly." I didn't follow. "Clearly?" "Yes," he said. "Not as success. Not as money. Just as you." I thought about that. About the way my family treated me. The way they overlooked me, dismissed me, assumed I would find my place eventually but never expected much. "They underestimate you," he went on. "And that is not always a weakness. Sometimes, it is an advantage." I stayed quiet, listening. "It gives you freedom," he said. "Freedom to make mistakes without judgment. Freedom to grow without pressure. Freedom to build something that is truly yours." I looked down at my hands, thinking about the past months, the quiet work, the absence of questions, the space I had to figure things out on my own. He was right. "They won't see it coming," he added softly. There was no excitement in his voice, no sense of revenge. Just calm certainty. From that day on, we didn't speak about it often. We didn't need to. There was an understanding between us that didn't require constant words. Sometimes, he would ask small questions, just enough to know things were moving forward. And I would answer simply. Nothing more, nothing less. He never tried to interfere. Never offered to step in or take control. He just watched. And waited. Now, standing in that dining room, with my family finally hearing the truth, I understood what he had been waiting for all along. Not just for the moment of surprise, but for the moment of realization. As I glanced toward him, I saw that same calm expression on his face. But this time, there was something else there too. Satisfaction. Not because of the money, but because everything had unfolded exactly as he knew it would. And because, at last, the rest of them were beginning to see what he had seen in me all along. After Tony Wells spoke, the silence in the room did not break right away. It stayed there, heavy and unmoving, as if no one knew how to step past it without saying the wrong thing. I sat still in my chair, my hands resting lightly on the table, watching them all as they tried to understand what they had just heard. For years, I had been invisible to them in the ways that mattered. And now, suddenly, I wasn't. My father, Richard Bennett, was the first to move. He slowly set his champagne glass down on the table, the soft clink of glass against wood echoing more than it should have in the quiet room.
"Is this true?" he asked.
His voice was steady, but I could hear something beneath it, uncertainty, maybe even disbelief. I turned my head slightly toward him and nodded. Yes.
That was all I said. No long explanation. No attempt to soften it.
Across from me, Clara stared as if she was trying to match this version of me with the one she thought she knew.
"Since when?" she asked.
Her voice was quieter than usual, almost careful. 3 years, I replied. The words seemed to settle into the room slowly, like dust in sunlight.
3 years.
Long enough for everything to change without them noticing. Aunt Margaret let out a short, uneasy laugh.
"That's not possible," she said. "You must have had help."
I did, I answered calmly. From people who believed in me.
She didn't respond to that. None of them did. Because that was the part they couldn't argue with. For a moment, no one spoke again.
I could see the questions forming in their expressions, the quiet realization that there was an entire part of my life they had never seen, never even suspected. Then my grandfather, Edward Bennett, stood up. The movement was slow, but it changed the room instantly. Everyone turned toward him, not because he demanded attention, but because he had always had it without asking. "I told you all," he said, his voice calm but clear. "You were too busy looking at what was loud to notice what was quiet."
No one interrupted him. No one disagreed. Because deep down, they knew he was right.
My mother, Eleanor Bennett, looked at me again, but this time her expression had changed.
It was no longer just shock.
There was something else there, something more thoughtful, maybe even uncertain. As if she was seeing me for the first time.
And maybe she was.
I looked around the table slowly, meeting each of their eyes one by one. These were the same people who had shaped my world for years, the same people whose opinions once felt so important.
But now, something had shifted. Not in them. In me.
"I didn't build this for you," I said quietly. "But I'm not hiding it anymore."
My voice didn't shake. It didn't need to.
Because I wasn't asking for their approval.
I never had been. I pushed my chair back gently and stood up.
The sound broke the stillness just enough to remind everyone that this moment was real, that it wasn't something they could ignore or explain away.
No one tried to stop me. No one told me to sit back down.
For once, they were all listening.
I turned my head slightly toward my grandfather.
He was already looking at me, his expression steady, his eyes calm. And then, just like before, he smiled. But this time, it was different. Not the quiet smile of someone waiting for the right moment. This was the smile of someone who knew the moment had already arrived. And as I walked away from the table, I realized something I hadn't fully understood until then. For 3 years, I had been building something in silence. But this moment right here, was where everything truly began.